Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 530 for the 15th of Iyar in a regular year. So one Shabbos, I was visiting my brother and his family, and I was hanging out with my cute and very brainy little nephew. I think he was around 9 years old at the time. And he says to me, Auntie Sarid, is 10 years a long time or a short time? And not knowing where he was going with this, I thought for a second and I said, well, 10 years, that sounds to me like it's quite a long time. And he replied, he said, no. He said, 10 years? 10 years is a very short amount of time. And he proceeded and he said, because if a second is short, then a minute is short. And if a minute is short, then an hour is short. And if an hour is short, then a day is short. And if a day is short, then a week is short. And if a week is short, then a month is short. And if a month is short, then a year is short. And if a year is short, then 10 years is really a short amount of time. And I was really mesmerized and taken aback. I mean, I knew he was a smart kid to begin with. But what I realized is that this kid had actually come up, assuming he had come up with this on his own. I don't know. Maybe he heard it from somewhere. I'm not sure. But he basically came up with Zeno's paradox. So Zeno's paradox, for those of you who are not familiar, is this, it's a paradox that was set forth by a Greek philosopher named Zeno, who basically explains how motion is an illusion. And this paradox has been challenged somewhat and discussed and brought up in different angles. But the basic idea of it is that if you look at any distance between any 2 points, there's not really any real distance between them, because when you look at the distance between any 2 points, then there's always going to be a half point between those 2 points. And so it's like if you want to kind of like measure how far something is, you can say, well, okay, what's the halfway point between these 2 points? And then again, you can say, okay, what's the halfway point between those 2 points now? So let's say if you had 10 miles, then you had okay, what's the halfway point between the starting point and the 10-mile point? That would be 5 miles. And then what's the halfway point between the starting point and the 5 miles? It's 2.5 miles, and so forth. And you continue to do this. And what you'll find is you can never get to that starting point. There's always going to be another halfway point, and you can never quite touch that. Those 2 points can never quite meet. Yet we know that somehow they do, right? Somehow we do get from point A to point B. Somehow all of those seconds do add up to 10 years. But it's one of those things that really baffle the mind. And philosophers and mathematicians, while they've provided certain explanations for it, there's a certain level of paradox that still exists within that, how that infinite process can really lead to a finite result. So the reason why I'm bringing this up here today, and the way that it relates to the Tanya that we're going to be learning about, is, and again for context, we are in the middle of chapter 48 of Likkutei Amarim, is that today we're really going to be focusing all about the concept of finitude, of how when it comes to finite numbers, when it comes to things that are finite, whether we're talking about something which is one, like a second, or we're talking about something that is 10 years, or the way that the Alter Rebbe is going to explain it, whether we're talking about the number one or we're talking about the number a billion, than literally a billion or a trillion even. These are all just numbers, and really at the basis of it, they're really the same because they're both made up of the same stuff. Like a trillion is really just made up of 1 trillion ones, versus when it comes to infinity, infinity is a whole other realm. And perhaps this concept of Zeno's paradox and this idea, this paradoxical element of it, of how it is that we're able to travel from one distance to another, even though it really is an infinite process, perhaps it gives us a little bit of a glimpse. Perhaps this is Hashem's way of giving us a little bit of a glimpse into the miracle of infinitude, the miracle of what it means to have an infinite God create a finite world. So let's get into the text and see how the Alter Rebbe explains all of this. So for context, yesterday we were really talking about the idea of how it is truly something miraculous, the fact that our world exists, and that the real question is not does God exist, but it's really do we exist, or how is it that we exist? And really this is ultimately, if you think about it, it's the same, it's actually Zeno's paradox. Like this Zeno's paradox is actually very much related to yesterday's episode as much as it is to today. How is it that we are able to travel from point A to point B if it's really an infinite process? How, in other words, how is it that Hashem was able to create the world, is able to create the world, when Hashem is an infinite being and our world is finite? And so the answer that was hinted at yesterday, that was the Alter Rebbe kind of gave us a little bit, is that there's this idea of contractions. There's this idea of tzimtzumim. And tzimtzumim is something that is a big topic in Chassidus, and it's spoken about at length and in detail in many different places. And today, the Alter Rebbe is going to introduce this idea of tzimtzumim again, this idea of contractions, but he's not going to get into too much detail with them, but he will talk a little bit about this idea. So here we go. So the Alter Rebbe begins, and he says that the details of these contractions that we've been talking about, what they are and how they work and everything, now is not the place to really elaborate upon them. However, says the Alter Rebbe, in a general sense, they act in a way of concealment and obscuring of the drawing down of the light and the vitality, so that this light and vitality will not come down and be drawn and illuminated into the lower realms in a way of revelation, to be able to be vested within them and to be able to influence them and give them vitality in a way of making them come into being from something from nothing, but rather this light comes down in a way, these concealment, these tzimtzumim cause the light to come down in a way that it just gives like a glimmer of the light and the glimmer of the vitality, and this causes so that these beings, these creations, including us down here, will be in an aspect of finitude and of limits. And so this vitality, this light, this revelation that we get is very, very small, and it's like considered like nothing in comparison to the infinite revelation, the revelation that actually has no limit to it. And there's no comparison between these two things at all. So now the Alter Rebbe is going to talk about this idea of comparison, of erech in Hebrew, which also means like proportion. So he says, so as is known, when it comes to proportion, when it comes to numbers, so this is where it's going to relate to that Zeno's paradox idea. So the number 1 has a comparison. We're able to compare it to the number 1,000,000 because 1 is a portion of 1,000,000. So again, this is my addendum here, is that going back to Zeno's paradox, if you have something that is a distance of 1 mile or it's a distance of 1,000,000 miles, while 1,000,000 miles might seem really, really far, it's just a bunch of 1 miles. It's just 1,000,000 of 1 miles. So 1 and 1,000,000 are not actually that different from each other. However, when we talk about something which is beyond limits and beyond any numbers, that there is no relations between it. So even if you take something like 1 billion or 1 trillion, when you compare it to infinity, then there's no comparison between it at all. So, and again, going back to Zeno's paradox, this is why it's such a paradoxical thing, that it's like, yes, we're going 1 mile, another mile, 2 miles, 3 miles, and we're having that distance each time we go, but this is an infinite process. And this is why it's so hard for us to grapple with this, because infinity and finitude don't really work together, and it doesn't really make sense. And this is what the Alter Rebbe is teaching us, is that even when we take huge numbers like a billion or a trillion, when compared to infinity, there's absolutely no comparison between them, to the point that we can't even say that, just like we say that the number one in comparison to a billion trillion has a relation to it, even though it might seem like this really vast comparison, the numbers a billion and a trillion in compared to infinity do not even have that level. It's not like if you take a billion billions, then you'll have infinity, or a trillion trillions, and then you'll have infinity. Even if you have a trillion gazillion whatever, you're never going to reach infinity. It's a totally, infinity is a whole other realm. It's something totally different. So in comparison to infinity, even huge numbers like a billion, a trillion, whatever it is, they have absolutely no relevance when it comes to infinity. And now the Alter Rebbe is going to go on to explain to us how this logic really applies in terms of helping us understand how God's radiance, which is the source of all of the worlds, including the world in which we live, is, as great as this radiance might seem to us, insofar as it vivifies and is present and is radiating within all of the worlds, in comparison to its source, in comparison to the hidden infinite light of God, there's no way to compare it. It's like comparing infinity to any number, whether you're comparing infinity to a billion or to one, it's really the same, just to really give us that sense of the infinitude of God's ultimate light. So the Alter Rebbe says that this is exactly how it is when we talk about the radiance that we receive here in this world, and the radiance that is vested within all of the worlds, whether we're talking about the supernal worlds or the lower worlds, that is vested within these worlds in order to vivify them. So the light that we experience here in this world is like nothing. It has no comparison at all to the true light, to the light which is concealed and which is hidden in an aspect of infinity, in the aspect of Ein Sof. And that true light, like the source of the light that we experience, does not actually get vested and is not actually here in this world in a way of revelation in order to vivify us, but rather it just encompasses us from above. It encompasses above these worlds from above, and it's called the light of Sovev Kol Almin. This is a term that comes up in Chassidus a lot. It means the light that encompasses all the world. So just to break that down again, just to explain that a little bit more. So again, the light that is vivifying us in a more tangible way down here is really a very minute amount of light, very minute version of the source of that light, which the source of that light we can't experience because it would be too much for us. And that source of that light is a more encompassing light. It surrounds all the world. It's not vested within the worlds, and it's called Sovev Kolamin. And when we say Sovev Kolamin, when we say that it encompasses and surrounds all the world from above, we don't mean this in like a spatial way. We don't mean that it's like here we are on Earth, and then it's like above us, up in the heavens, up in space, there's like this light that encompasses us. It's not a physical thing. We say above because this is like a way we can understand it, but it's more like a figure of speech. It's like a figurative sense of above, because we know when it comes to spirituality, there's no space is not a thing. Spirituality is not bound by space. We can't use spatial understanding to understand the idea of spirituality. So rather, what do we mean when we say the idea of that it encompasses and surrounds all the worlds from above? This is in terms of the aspect of revelation and of influence. So what this means basically is that, like, when we talk about the idea of influence is an aspect of revelation. So when we say that something is influencing something else, it means that it's revealing it. So the influence of this light is the revelation of the light in the worlds. And that influence, we can also say, is called a halbasha. It's called a vestment, a garment that it's being invested in that thing, because it becomes enclosed within the worlds. That these worlds understand and have with them, like they wear the clothing of, so to speak, of this influence that they receive. So basically, it's like just to explain this. So it's like sort of like we're putting a few words together as synonyms. So we're saying that When we talk about the word influence, another word for understanding influence is revelation. And another word for revelation is vestment, is enclosed within something. So another analogy that we can use to understand this is the idea, and this is another analogy that comes up in, he doesn't bring it up here, the Alter Rebbe, but it does come up in Chassidus, is when we talk about a teacher teaching a student. So when a teacher teaches a student, they're influencing that student, and the influence that they give, the words that they use to influence that student gets revealed. That's the part of the teacher's brain that gets revealed to the student. And that part of the teacher's brain that gets revealed to the student becomes enclosed within that student. Like, so for example, right now, I'm teaching you Tanya, and I'm only revealing a certain part of my brain to you. There's a lot of my brain that is being concealed right now that you don't see, but the part of my brain, the part of my thought process that is being revealed to you is the part that I'm influencing to you. And that part that I'm influencing to you is you are then taking that and you're integrating it into your mind so that it is now vested within you. So that's exactly the process, or not exactly. I mean, God's different, obviously, so it's lahavdil, but that's basically the process whereby God creates the world, is that there's a certain amount of his light, and most of his light is concealed, just like most of my brain is concealed right now and you don't see it. But there's a portion of his brain, there's an aspect of his brain, there's an aspect of him, of his light, that he does reveal into the world. And that revelation that he pours forth into the world is the part that gets vested within that world. But yet, then there's another aspect of the influence that is not revealed, but rather it's in a way of concealment and hiddenness, and the worlds do not understand it. And thus we cannot say that it is something which is vested within the world, but rather it just surrounds and encompasses them. So again, going back to the analogy of teaching, that while you are hearing certain aspects of my thought process, there's a lot of my thought process, there's a lot of my brain that lahavdil, obviously in comparison to God, but there's a lot of my brain that you don't see. Most of my brain you don't see. And so that part of my brain that you don't see, it's still there. My brain is still very much there when my full brain is still very much there when I'm teaching you these concepts, but it's more there in a way of surrounding and encompassing. Like it's kind of there in this more subtle kind of way. And so and we can't say that my entire brain is vested within you. Like that would be ridiculous, obviously, right? And so then the Alter Rebbe goes on to say, and he says that therefore, since the worlds are in an aspect of finitude and limits, we find that this influence of the infinite light does not get vested within them in a way of revelation, but rather just a glimmer of it becomes revealed within them, just a very small way. So again, since you guys, like I'm talking to you guys right now, your brains are only limited, and you're listening to this in a way of space and time at a certain time. It wouldn't be possible for me to give over my entire brain to you. So just like that, the entire world is finite. So they would not be able to receive God's infinite radiance in an infinite way, but they can only get it in a limited way. And so this is how the revelation of God gets expressed into this world, is in this limited way. However, concludes the Alter Rebbe, the main aspect of this light is without limits, is without constrictions so much. And it's to the point that it's called makif, it's called and sovev, it's called encompassing and surrounding, because, and the reason why again we use this term encompassing and surrounding, because it doesn't actually get vested within the worlds, because the worlds again are in an aspect of finitude and limits. So that's the end of this section. And so just to conclude and bring it all together, to me, the main point that the Alter Rebbe is bringing out in the section today is to really make us aware of the fact that there's a whole bunch of stuff that we don't see. Just like when you are hearing my words and you're hearing me teach this Tanya, talk to you guys on this podcast, you can have a sense that there's a person behind these worlds. There's a Sareed that is like way beyond just what I'm teaching you. Like I have a whole life. I have a whole bunch of things that I do. I have a whole bunch of different thoughts that are very much removed and and much bigger and broader than just the mere words that I'm teaching you guys in this podcast. So too similarly, when we experience life, when we experience the world, that's a certain amount of God's light. That's a very but that's really just a very, very small ray. That's a very, very, very constricted aspect of God's light. And in fact, God's true light, the source of that vitality and where it comes from, is something much bigger and something much greater. And we can't experience it by virtue of our limitations and our finitude, but it is very much there. It's just there in this more like encompassing and hovering manner, in the same way that my brain, so to speak, is hovering in this podcast. My personality, the entirety of Sarid is in this podcast. So like maybe one way to think about it is that if you had, let's say, a totally different person who had the script, like they had a transcription of my podcast and they said the words word for word in the podcast, there'd be a difference, because it's my essence wouldn't be encompassing in the same way as it is right now in me giving over these words to you, even though what it is that you're experiencing in a more direct way is the finitude of my words. The entirety of my being and my entire thought process is still there. It's just there in a more encompassing way. And similarly to that is the radiance that we experience of God in the world in a direct way and in a more like internalized way, is that more like finite kind of light that is very constricted, but the infinite light is still there. It's just there in this more encompassing and like hovering surrounding kind of way. That's the end of the section for today. So the point of all this and the point of explaining all this is to give us a sense that what we're experiencing down here in this world, and really even in the higher spiritual worlds, is really such a minute amount that it's so hard for us to even imagine how minute the amount of light that we're experiencing is, that it's so much more minute than a second is compared to 10 years, or that one is in compared to a trillion. It's like, it's way beyond that sense of relevancy, that sense of proportion. So that's it for today. And we're going to continue along these lines tomorrow, and I'll speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarid Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.